Human property hanging in the family tree. The story begins with Mariah Haynes Johnson, a woman whose bloodline carries both love and suffering, both freedom and chains. Oral history and fragile documents confirm her truth. Mariah was born around 1836 in Spring Hill, Hempstead County, Arkansas. She would one day become a wife to Pendleton Callier and later to Gus Murray. But before that, her roots were set in the soil of slavery. Her mother, Clarissa Chloe Fox, was born around 1800. Her grandmother, Tisby Fox, had come into the world around 1785. Both Chloe and Tisby were enslaved by John Mosby Binford, a man whose family carried the name of Quaker respectability. The Binfords had settled in Virginia in the 1600s, and by 1672, the Quaker faith had declared that slavery was inhumane, a sin against Christianity itself. Families divided over this declaration. Some freed those they held in bondage, but John Mosby Binford did not. He clung to human property as wealth, and so Chloe Fox, a young girl, was handed down like furniture, given to his daughter, Lucy Stith Binford, as a wedding present. On September 25th, 1817, Lucy Binford married Colonel William Martin Burton. With this union came not only love and land, but the flesh and blood of enslaved women. Colonel Burton soon uprooted his family and the enslaved families tied to him, carrying them into the Deep South, first Alabama, then eventually Arkansas. Along the way, Chloe and her husband Archie Haynes had a son, Henry, born in March 1818. Meanwhile, Lucy and Colonel Burton bore daughters of their own, Mary Frances around 1823 and Martha Eliza around 1826. Two women, Lucy and Chloe, both born in 1800, one white, one black, one mistress, one enslaved, their lives intertwined, their children raised together but never equal. For while Lucy's daughters were born to privilege, Chloe and her sister Tisby raised them alongside their own children, bound by a chain of servitude that could never be escaped. But Colonel Burton's prosperity was fragile. He carried a history of debts. Debts he paid by selling off land and lives. In 1834, he sold the Cold Springs plantation, 930 acres and 21 human beings, mothers, fathers, children, torn apart, bartered like crops. A year later, the colonel packed up once again. With his family and those enslaved who remained, he moved to Spring Hill, Arkansas. It was there, in 1836, that Chloe gave birth to a daughter, Mariah Haynes. Mariah's birth marked not just another child in the world, but the continuation of two legacies: the legacy of bondage and the legacy of resilience. For every acre the Burtons gained, every debt they paid, their wealth was tied to the lives of families like Mariah's. Families recorded in ledgers as property, yet living, breathing, and enduring. And so, hanging in this family tree are not just names and dates, but chains. The story of Mariah Haynes Johnson reminds us that behind every branch, there are roots. And some of those roots were bound, scarred, and sold. Yet they survived. Enslavement offered no guarantees. Families lived each day under the shadow of loss, knowing that the whim of a master or the weight of a debt could tear their lives apart. Once again, Colonel William Martin Burton looked to human beings as collateral, trading flesh for fortune. With the enslaved families bound to him, he purchased more acres along his Red River plantation. Then came the day that shattered Chloe's heart. On April 29th, 1837, her son Henry, just 19 years old, was sold. His new owner, Laurent Millendin, a wealthy slaver from New Orleans, Louisiana. For the enslaved, Louisiana was whispered about as the land of no return. The fields were harsher, the labor unending, and the distance so great that those sent there almost never came back. At the banks of Dooley's Ferry, Chloe watched her son, bound among others, forced aboard. The river carried him away as though carrying away her very soul. In that moment, the weight of slavery crushed her to the earth. Chloe fell to her knees, her cries drowned by the waters and the voices of men counting profit. And yet, even in grief, life did not pause. 2 years later, in 1839, Chloe and Archie welcomed another child, a baby girl. They named her Tisby, after Chloe's mother. The birth was both joy and sorrow, for the child came into a world of chains, born enslaved before she even took her first breath. Still, Chloe clung to hope. She pleaded with her mistress, Lucy Binford Burton. She begged, "Bring back my Henry." Perhaps it was compassion, perhaps guilt, or perhaps just the influence a mistress held over her husband. But Lucy took her pleas to heart. Colonel Burton made the long trip to New Orleans, seeking to reclaim Henry, but Millendin refused. To him, Henry was property, and property was profit. For over a year, negotiations dragged on. The price of love was measured in dollars, bargaining and bartering over a son who was priceless to his mother. Finally, with a hefty payment, Henry was returned, not to freedom, but to Lucy Burton's household. For Chloe, it was a moment of stolen victory. Her son was back, yet still in bondage. The chains had not been broken, only shifted. Still, to see Henry's face again, to hold him, to know he had not vanished into the land of no return, was a miracle in the dark night of slavery. On August 26, 1841, the Burton daughters were wed. Mary Frances Burton married Sawyer Haywood, and her sister Martha Eliza Burton married Daniel Polk Logan. For the white daughters of Colonel Burton, marriage meant expansion of land, wealth, and power. But for the enslaved bound to their names, it meant chains passed from one master to another. 2 years later, in 1843, Colonel Burton once again turned to human beings as collateral. He mortgaged his property, Chloe, Tisby, Maria, and Henry, pledging their very lives to his wife's nephew, Richard H. Binford. Every acre tilled, every drop of sweat, every harvested crop from their hands would no longer serve their own survival, but would instead enrich another branch of the Binford family tree. Then came the day that would scar Maria forever. It was an afternoon like any other. She was young, only about 7 years old, carrying water to the enslaved on the Red River plantation. But on this day, the river carried not life, but death. Maria witnessed a horror no child should ever see. A slaver and his men turned against their own enslaved people, men, women, and children. With whips, clubs, and blades, they struck them down in cold blood. Screams echoed across the fields, silenced only by violence. One by one, the lifeless bodies were dragged and thrown into the dark waters of the lake as though they were nothing more than refuse. Maria froze, paralyzed by terror. Her small hands trembled, the jug of water nearly slipping as she hid her face. But she could not block the sound, the sight, the smell of death. That night, shaken and terrified, she whispered her story to Colonel Burton. She told him what she had seen, every detail seared into her memory. Burton understood the danger. If such savagery could happen on a nearby plantation, it could happen to his own. And so, Under the cover of darkness, he gathered his enslaved family. They boarded Dooley's ferry, crossing into the shadowed waters of Louisiana. But this escape was no deliverance. It was only a shift in ownership. Colonel Burton gave Mariah, Chloe and Henry as property to his daughter, Martha Eliza, tying their fate forever to her husband, Daniel Polk Logan. The family was torn yet again. The elder Tisby Fox and little Tisby Haynes were left behind, kept in Burton's household. Their cries of separation echoed in the night. And then, something unexpected, perhaps guilt, perhaps fear, perhaps exhaustion from the weight of slavery itself. Colonel Burton quit the business of slave trading. But for Chloe, Mariah, Henry, and the rest, the chains remained. Their lives were still held in the hands of others. Their freedom still a dream whispered in the dark. The tree grew, but its roots remained shackled. Years passed, and the tides of time carried the family from Arkansas to New Orleans, a city of music, money, and misery. The streets hummed with trade, laughter, and the cries of the enslaved. In that world, Henry Haynes found his gift. He became a skilled shoemaker known for crafting fine leather shoes worn by gentlemen of stature. Each stitch was precise, each pair a quiet rebellion, proof that his hands, once bound in chains, now created art. His sister, Mariah, grew into a woman of grace and skill. She became a seamstress, her fingers dancing through silk and lace, sewing gowns for the wealthy ladies of New Orleans, the same women who dined on the labor of those beneath them. To the astonishment of many, Daniel Polk Logan allowed Henry and Mariah to keep the money they earned. Perhaps he saw their worth, or perhaps it was profit cloaked in mercy. But their small taste of independence would soon be tested by history itself. Logan and his associate Sawyer Hayward, along with Jefferson Davis, the future president of the Confederacy, were men of vast enterprise. Together, they owned the Louisiana Cotton Press and the Alabama Factors Press, great engines of commerce in the booming cotton exchange. Their fortunes were built upon the very fibers picked by enslaved hands. But while the men counted cotton, Mariah sought something more. She found love. She married Gus Murray, and they had one child, Gus Murray Jr. Yet their union was short-lived, worn thin by the weight of the world they lived in. Then, on November 14th, 1858, Mariah's life turned again. She married Pendleton Callier, a drayman from the Yancey plantation. Their love, born in a world of uncertainty, shone like a fragile flame. A year later, on December 18th, 1859, Mariah gave birth to a daughter, Chloe Callier. Her name carried hope, the echo of her grandmother Chloe, and the strength of women who had endured generations of bondage. Meanwhile, Tisby, Mariah's younger sister, crossed paths with destiny. She met Ben Williams, a man who served none other than Jefferson Davis himself, the President of the Confederate States, inside the White House of the Confederacy in Richmond, Virginia. Despite the storm of war around them, love found a way. Tisby and Ben Williams married, binding two worlds that history would never expect to meet, but the winds of war were rising. On July 11th, 1863, Pendleton Callier took a brave step toward freedom and history. He joined the 7th Regiment of the United States Colored Troops, fighting for the Union cause, fighting for the promise that no man, woman, or child would ever again be sold like livestock. As he prepared to leave, Mariah stood trembling, clutching his hands. He told her quietly, "I ran from the Yancey plantation. If they catch me, they'll hang me for it." they embraced beneath the weight of both love and fear. And then he was gone, marching not just into war, but into legend. Back in New Orleans, the world grew dangerous for all people of color, freed or formerly enslaved. Whispers of raids, uprisings, and retaliation filled the air. Fearing for Mariah and her family's safety, Daniel Polk Logan gathered them in his household and fled the chaos of Louisiana. They crossed into Debye, Mississippi, settling along the glimmering Gulf Coast. There, Logan and Hayward built luxury mansions overlooking the sea, white columns, sweeping verandas, and the illusion of peace. But beneath those mansions lay buried histories of bondage, of love, of survival. For the war had come, and no mansion, no ocean, no wealth could wash away the truth. Freedom was rising, and nothing would ever be the same. The war ended, but peace did not come easy. Mariah Callia, once the strong, hopeful wife of a Union soldier, now found herself alone. Her husband, Pendleton Callia, had gone off to fight for freedom and never truly returned to her. In time, she filed for divorce. Her voice, firm, dignified, weary, echoed through the courthouse. He deserted me, went after other women, without any cause or provocation. I used all my efforts to bring him home, but he roamed in bad company and drunkenness. It was rare, almost unthinkable for a woman of color to stand before the law and demand justice in her own name. But Mariah was no ordinary woman, and though her heart had been bruised, love was not done with her yet. She met Carey Johnson, the man who would become the great love of her life. Together, they built not just a family, but a legacy. 9 children were born of that union, their laughter echoing across the green fields of Debye, Mississippi. Carey was a landscaper, a man of quiet strength. He worked the soil and the sea, and in time, he purchased land and gave it to Mariah. But she didn't stop there. Across the road, Henry, Mariah's brother, made history as the first black man to purchase land in Debye, Mississippi. His mansion rose proudly beside the grand homes of Logan and Hayward, defying every rule of the Old South. Mariah purchased more land, acre by acre, until her holdings stretched across the horizon. Before long, people spoke her name with awe and admiration. Mariah's estate was named the land of Mariah Johnson. She had become the first woman of color in the state of Mississippi to own so much land, land wrested from the soil that once enslaved her family. Mariah believed in God, family, and land, the 3 pillars of her world. And she believed in protection. She owned a gun, and she taught her daughters how to shoot. In a time when mobs and night riders hunted the innocent, she would not live in fear. She raised and sold livestock, managed her fields, and helped Carey tend to his landscaping business. Their home was alive with work, worship, and the sweet sound of survival. But Mariah's life carried her full circle. One night, working in the household of Jefferson Davis, the former president of the Confederacy, she found herself face to face with the man whose decisions had torn the nation apart. As the two sat in the dim light of the Davis home, Mariah told him of what she had seen as a child, the massacre on the Red River, when innocent enslaved men, women, and children were slaughtered and thrown into the water. Jefferson Davis, once so proud, sat in silence. Tears welled in his eyes. He whispered that he regretted the Civil War, the lives lost, the blood spilled, the sin of enslavement. Mariah said nothing more. The truth had already spoken for itself. Through every hardship, Mariah's faith never wavered. She attended church every Sunday, dressed in white, her Bible in hand. The church was her sanctuary, until hatred struck again. A dispute between the local sheriff and a group of black boys ignited fury among the white townsmen. That night, they burned Mariah's church to the ground. Tragedy followed. Chloe's husband, Abram Henry Davis, was shot and killed. The pastor of their church was hanged alongside his 13-year-old son, a boy, barely old enough to understand why the world hated his skin. Still, Mariah did not break. Her faith stood taller than the flames that tried to consume her. Even when the Ku Klux Klan came to her door, torches flickering in the dark, threats spilling from their mouths, Mariah stood firm. Their fury came when her daughter Victoria secretly married a white man. But Mariah did not bow to fear. Her message was clear, and her courage unshaken. You can burn my church. You can take my husband. You can threaten my blood. But you will never take my faith nor my land. Through fire, through blood, through hatred, Mariah Haynes Johnson endured. From the child born in chains, to the woman who owned the land once worked by her enslaved ancestors. Her story is not just one of survival, it is the story of rebirth, of a woman who turned oppression into legacy, of faith that no flame could destroy. Mariah Haynes Johnson's legacy did not die when she drew her final breath in 1925. By then, she had lived through slavery, war, and the burning hatred of Reconstruction. She had buried loved ones, outlived enemies, and built an empire of faith and land. When she passed, the bells of Debise tolled low and mournful. The townspeople, black and white alike, whispered her name with reverence, for though she had been born enslaved, she died free, a woman of land, legacy, and unshakable spirit. But the story did not end there. Her bloodline carried the rhythm of endurance, a rhythm that turned into music. Her grandson, Elliot Beale, was born with the gift of sound in his fingertips. In New Orleans, he became known as a pianist whose hands told stories, stories of sorrow, hope, and redemption. Each key he pressed seemed to summon the voices of those who came before him. Elliot would sit at the piano, close his eyes, and feel the heartbeat of his grandmother's struggle pulsing through every note. The songs were not written in ink, but in memory, in pain, in prayer, in pride. It was in that city of jazz and soul that Elliot crossed paths with a powerful voice, his cousin-in-law, Mahalia Jackson. Mahalia's voice could move mountains. She sang like a storm wrapped in sunlight, a voice that could make sinners weep and saints shout, hallelujah. Together, Elliot Beale and Mahalia Jackson shared Mariah's story, not in words alone, but through the spirit of their music. They told of a woman born in bondage who built a kingdom from the ashes of slavery, a woman who taught her children to fight, to pray, to never bow. The story of Mariah Haynes Johnson traveled beyond the bayous and the back roads. It reached the churches of Chicago, the gospel tents of New Orleans, and the marches for freedom in the 1950s. And when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. rose to speak to the soul of a nation, he had already heard Mariah's story, passed from the lips of Mahalia Jackson and Elliot Beale, who carried that fire within them. In her story, Dr. King saw not just history, but prophecy, a vision of what it meant to suffer and yet still rise. When Mahalia stood behind him in Washington, D.C. and cried out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." She carried with her the spirit of Mariah, a woman who dreamed long before the world would let her. And so, through the ages, Mariah Haynes Johnson's story became more than genealogy. It became a testament, a sacred thread woven through time, linking the enslaved and the free, the past and the future. She began as human property, hanging in the branches of another's family tree, but she became the root of her own. And from that root grew music, freedom, and faith, a legacy that still sings today.